Welcome to European Journeys. This is the fourth stage of a series in which we explore the Swedish Reformation. For the past two stages, we have explored the life, or at least the earlier part of the life of the father of the Swedish Reformation, Olaus Petri. We visited first the city where he grew up, where he was born and grew up, went to school, that was Örebro. And then we went to the city of Strängnäs, where he began his ministry. Well, for this stage, we are going to visit the capital of Sweden, and that is obviously Stockholm. So as you look at the map, we are zooming in the region of Stockholm, and so Stockholm is located there by the sea. Stockholm began to be founded on an island which is today named Gamla Stan, that is the old town of Stockholm. There are many prominent buildings there that we find. Obviously, the Royal Palace, which is there on the island, together with also the Stock Exchange building, which is called Börshuset in Swedish. Well, between those two buildings, we find Sweden's most emblematic church and also Stockholm's oldest church, and that church is named Storkyrkan, that is the Great Church of Stockholm. It was founded in the year 1306, that is about 50 years after the foundation of the city. There in Storkyrkan we find some landmarks that refer to Olaus Petri. For example, we have the grave of Olaus Petri that is there right inside the church near the pulpit, and outside the church we have a statue that is made in his honor and which is facing the square named Slotbacken. So that is for the landmarks that we find there about the father of the Swedish Reformation. And the reason why he is so well remembered there is that Olaus Petri ministered there in the church for about 30 years, a bit less than 30 years, until his death. So, and in fact his ministry there brought a significant transformation to the country of Sweden. Well, before we talk a little bit more about that, let's give a few words. Let's look a little bit at the history of Stockholm. Stockholm was founded, according to the Swedish chronicler Erik Chronicle, it was founded by Birger Jarl, the Earl of Sweden, in the year 1252. And its original scope, was to be a fortress to protect Sweden, and in particular the main centers of the time, Sigtuna and Uppsala, from foreign attacks that at the time came from the east, from Karelia in particular. And so that's how Stockholm was born. But very quickly, because of its proximity to the Baltic Sea, it became a prominent international trade center. And with time, it became also a place where many people from abroad would come and live there, in particular German merchants. And in fact, in the 15th century, the city council was made of many German citizens. Up to half of the city council, in fact, was German-speaking. So that's for the early history of Stockholm. But then we get to the decade of the 1520s. That was a crucial decade for the history of Stockholm as a city and for Sweden as a whole. In November 1520, happened there in Stockholm the famous Stockholm bloodbath. Now that was an event that saw the execution of about 100 people who were charged for heresy, but that was the official charge. Really, in practice, it was a political reason that was behind that. These people had supported the movement for the independence of Sweden. At the time, Sweden was part of the Kalmar Union, and the King of Denmark tried to rule over Sweden at the time, King Christian II. And so this was a mass execution of people who in fact were backing the party for the independence of Sweden. And so in November 1520, really, very few people would have had very bright prospects for the city of Stockholm. And yet, less than a decade later, Stockholm was the first reformed city of Sweden. Now, how could such a change happen so quickly? This is what we are going to look at a little bit in the remaining of our times. In the year 1524, that was a pretty crucial time, in particular in the spring of 1524, yes, 500 years ago as I speak now. That was a time in which some of the most important positions of leadership in Stockholm were appointed to people of Lutheran convictions. Firstly, the role of the secretary of the city council was given to Olaus Petri himself. And at the same time, around the same time, the church, Storkyrkan, had its first Lutheran pastor. Now, the Storkyrkan in the church was in fact the headquarters of all the churches of Stockholm. Churches, monasteries, chapels were directly reporting to the leadership there at the Storkyrkan. And we know that in the era of Christendom, the church obviously had a prominent leading role in the life of a nation, in the life of a city, and that was no exception in Stockholm. So now, in the 1520s, we have at the city council and in the church some people with Lutheran convictions that are appointed. I have omitted to mention the name of the pastor there appointed at the Storkyrkan, and that is because the sources mention different names. There are sources that talk about Nikolaus Stecker, a German-born in Eisleben. And as for Lars Anjou, who wrote this history of the Swedish Reformation, a very good book about the history of the Swedish Reformation, well, he mentions a man named Mikael Langerbein. Well, whoever he was, we don't really know, but the point is that all sources agree that that pastor had been trained at Wittenberg at the feet of Martin Luther. So how is it that in such a short time, now we have the most prominent positions, the most important positions in the leadership of the city that are now given to people of Lutheran convictions? Well, if you remember our last stage, we began to talk about what happened there in Strängnäs. There is probably one reason that can be found there. In fact, Gustav Vasa was appointed king in the year 1523 there in Strängnäs. He had been seduced, attracted by the Lutheran doctrines that Olaus Petri preached, and that had in particular attracted Laurentius Andreae. We talked about him in our last stage, and Andreae became the chancellor of the king of Sweden. So he was the first man with Lutheran conviction to be appointed into a very important role such as the chancellor of the kingdom. Now, very quickly after his appointment as king, Gustav Vasa moved his headquarters to Stockholm, and there Andreae, of course, followed and became the chancellor there in Stockholm, operating from Stockholm. So we can assume that Andreae had an important role in appointing those people. The sources don't say so, but we can infer that. And a second reason that we can infer is that, as I said, there was a prominent German minority there in the city of Stockholm. These merchants were still in contact with their homeland, with Germany, and they were obviously aware of what was going on there, the Reformation that started with Martin Luther some 7 years earlier. And very likely, many of those people had adopted the Lutheran doctrines. So the wind was a wind for change there in Stockholm, just a few years after that infamous Stockholm bloodbath. Well, that doesn't mean that everything went easy for the Reformation. There was opposition. Firstly, Olaus Petri, who also preached at the Storkyrkan at the time because he was a deacon, if you remember from our last episode. Well, Olaus Petri in his sermons was very cutting edge. He preached from the Word of God, and that really caused reactions in the audience, and he received insults and even stones sometimes while he was preaching there in the church. Moreover, in the 1520s, there was an Anabaptist uprising. The Anabaptists were a group of people of very different convictions, but the preaching they were bringing there in Stockholm was foreign both to the Roman Catholics and to the Lutherans, and they led uprisings by destroying pictures and statues in the churches. So the atmosphere was not very peaceful in the city at the time. And moreover, Olaus Petri and Laurentius Andreae did not hesitate to to challenge the king when he was trying to take control over the church based on the word of God. Olaus Petri preached against the king very clearly, and that led even the two men to be charged and to receive even the death penalty against them. Well, that penalty was finally dropped, but you can see that the climate was not that easy at the time. Now, this is very interesting, this last point, the fact that Olaus Petri would challenge the king with the word of God. Olaus Petri understood what we call today the principle of the separation of church and state. But it was a different principle than the one we actually understand today. Today it's understood that, well, that means in the church, there the word of God is preached and obeyed, but in society it's a neutral place where other laws can rule. For Olaus Petri, that was not what he understood when we talk today about the separation of church and state. For him, church and state had to be separated, but under the sovereignty of God and under the sovereignty of His Word. And therefore, the role of the church and states were yet separated, they had their own sphere of sovereignty, but the church had to challenge the state when it was disobeying the word of God. And that's what Olaus Petri did. He spoke against the king because he was disobeying the word of God. They wanted to take control over the church. Just as in the Bible, we see that many times. Nathan challenging King David for his adultery, or even John the Baptist in the New Testament challenging Herod, the remarriage, the unlawful remarriage that he had. This principle is what led also the ministry of Olaus Petri. That was what led also Laurentius Andreae, in his convictions. They were led by a distinctly biblical worldview. Well, in spite of all these obstacles, the Reformation continued to advance, and it advanced faster in Stockholm than anywhere else in the country of Sweden. Eventually, the opposition subsided and the Lutheran doctrines were preached unhindered. Psalms in the church began to be sung in Swedish, and that was very new for the time. Also, initially, the monasteries were allowed to stay, but their appeal to the people was greatly diminished through these teachings, these Lutheran teachings that were coming to the people, that were spreading around in the city. Yes, the work of the reformers was crucial there in Stockholm, and even in the second half of the century, when these reformers were dead, when there was an attempt to return Sweden to the Church of Rome, where that attempt failed. Their work had changed Sweden, and Sweden was not ready to get back to its old order. And today, after 500 years, Sweden still enjoys the fruit of the work that they had done. But, in fact, our society is being greatly de-Christianized. The Christian worldview is becoming foreign in our lands, and so the church today needs to recover that Christian worldview, needs to recover that prophetic voice in society. So as a final word, I would like to challenge you or to encourage you to think in the following days about how can we uphold the word of God in our society today, and how can we bring the word of God to bear in society today and to speak up. Well, I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next time for another stage of European Journeys.